Welcome to Muslim Apologetics Australia. In this, I'll be debating a feminist from Pakistan who has a problem with polygamy in Islam. And basically, what they're trying to preach is a reform version of the Quran, where the verse regarding polygamous marriages is abrogated or outdated or no longer applies, because these people follow their whims and desires, and it goes against their own social norms, which is liberalism and secularism, because this is the colonialist Muslims who have been indoctrinated by Western ethics and standards, topped up with feminism and so forth. So what they do is, I've seen this person comment, they've commented and said, for instance, it is not possible for a man to share his love with 4 other women and so forth. This is not humanly possible. And so I came on and I responded to this, and I basically said, so I'm guessing you're also accusing the Prophet Muhammad for marrying 9 women all at the same time. And what do they conveniently say whenever you bring up a prophet? They'd say, here Fiza Wizam responds back by saying, prophets are ordained by their God. Who am I to judge them? I am just happy for a man's ex. So look at this. All this time, they judge a man and they say it's not humanly possible that a man can share his love with 4 other women. It's not humanly possible. So they're making a judgment. But soon as you say, oh, what about the prophet marrying 9 women? She turns around and says, well, he's a prophet, he's an exception, and who am I to judge? So you being a prophet, first of all, she said all men, and now she's saying, oh, but he's a prophet, who am I to judge him, and so forth. So I responded back and said, and what about the Quran that makes it permissible for men, not just prophets, to marry more than one wife? And this is the verse in Surah Al-Nisa 4:3. It says, and if you fear that you shall not be able to deal justly with the orphan girls, then marry other women of your choice, 2 or 3 or 4. But if you fear that you shall not be able to deal justly, then only one that your right hand possesses. That is nearer to prevent you from doing injustice. So the scripture allows this. Maybe you need to be careful when you speak against the Quran. Fiza then writes back and says, I have yet, listen to this, the so-called feminist that says they're not in a position to judge no one, look what she says conveniently. See, the whole premise of the feminists is that they love judging everyone, but soon as you question them, they say, oh, why are you judging me? Only God can judge. Or if you bring up the prophet, they're like, who am I to judge? Who am I to judge? And yet, they do the judging. Listen what they say in this comment. Have a listen. She quotes. I'm quoting verbatim for what they say. She says, I have yet see a man doing justice between 2 wives even. So forget about 4. She personally is yet to see a man doing justice between 2 wives. So I don't believe men of today are capable of doing justice between 2 or more spouses, given how human morals have changed. So notice, she's made an entire generalization and an entire judgment on every single Muslim. But before, when I brought up the Prophet, she's like, who am I to judge? And then when I bring up the Quran that shows that the Quranic instruction where it gives permissibility to marry more than one, it's not just for the Prophet, but also for Muslims. She turns around after saying, who is she to judge? She turns around and says, oh, but she doesn't believe that any man is capable of fulfilling this condition, right? So she's made a complete judgment on all men. the double standards and the hypocrisy. She first says, who am I to judge? And then she makes her whole judgment on everyone. And then she turns around and says, so not being able to do justly automatically changes the permission granted in the verse. So look what she does. Not only does she claim that there is no man that can fulfill this condition of being just between two wives, it also automatically now changes the verse, changes the permission granted in the verse. So I said it in my response, nowhere in the Quran does it say a verse is cancelled because no one can fulfill its condition. That would be like saying, hypothetically speaking, if not a single person prays salah, this means the verse regarding salah are no longer applicable? Do you see how absurd and ridiculous that sounds? Regardless if there are no Muslims, men who can be just in the modern world, does not mean that this verse is no longer valid. All it means is that there isn't a single Muslim who can live up to its expectation. Finally, you claimed you're not here to judge no one, and yet you claim to know of every single polygamous marriage. Can I ask, how do you know there are no Muslim men out there that can't fulfill this condition? Do you know every relationship from Pakistan to Iraq to Turkey to Indonesia? Please stop making extremely ignorant statements. Women like yourself, unfortunately, are what we call reformists. They are people who actively try and change the Quran because a certain verse doesn't go hand in hand to their mindset, and so they will follow their own desires to change it. There are verses in the Quran for such people as we will read. This is in Surah Al-Jathiyah. Allah Almighty says, have you seen him who has taken his desires as his God? Allah has let him go astray knowingly and has sealed his hearing and his heart and covered his eyes. This ayah is addressing the issue of following your whims and desires and treating them like a god. Example, you do whatever you like as if it's a command you just have to follow. But we should only be following Allah's command, not our whims and desires. Islamically, the more you control your desires, the closer you are to Allah, and the more you follow your desires, the further away you are from Him. Idol worship doesn't always mean worshipping physical statues. Sometimes following your own whims is like worshipping them, a hidden and a dangerous form of worship. This is why Allah is warning us against this trap of shaitan. Allah created the desires in us, but we have to control them and fulfill them only in moderation. Fiza then writes back and says, listen, watch the lie, how they get caught out. She says, I never claimed that the verse is cancelled. I said men today can't take 4 wives and be just, so better stick with one. The verse stands correct and true. So notice, she first says, and you can go back to what she says here. This is the second paragraph. She says, because men of today are so I don't believe men of today are capable of doing justice between 2 or more spouses, given how human morals have changed. So not being able to do justice automatically changes the permission granted in the verse. So she's basically saying that the verse has been abrogated because in today's modern times, the morals have changed. And so, based on that, and based on her own experience where she can't find any man who's in a polygamous marriage giving justice to 2 wives, in this modern age, this is now changes the permissibility in the verse because we can't apply it in our modern time. So she's technically invalidating the verse. She's basically saying it no longer applies, it's abrogated. And then she conveniently lies when she gets caught out. And I'm going to show you how she continuously lies. She says, I never claimed the verse is counts. What are you claiming then? When you're saying it's no longer valid? I then responded and said, again, you keep repeating the same thing. Where is your evidence that all men of today cannot do justice? Are you aware that there is a hadith that says most women will be in hellfire because they can't be just with their husbands? According to the same standard of logic, will you also preach that women cannot be trusted, therefore men and women should both avoid getting married? You need to show consistency in your argument. If you're going to preach that men of today shouldn't engage themselves in more than one wife because they can't be just, then according to the same standard, women should avoid marrying any man because the hadiths say women cannot be just with their husbands and that majority will be punished because of this. And so as to avoid being punished, you should rather not get married at all. Will you now be consistent in your logic and apply it for all marriages? Well, and look what Fizza writes back. She says, remember I brought up the hadith where it says most of the dwellers of hellfire are women because they don't give enough alms, charity, and they're not grateful for their husbands. It tells us why this is the case. Listen what she says. She says in reply, sorry, I believe in the Quran. The rest is all questionable. Now a hadith rejecter. So I believe in the Quran, the rest is all questionable. And I wrote back and I said, conveniently reject the hadith because it doesn't support your feministic views. Of course you are a Quranist for a good reason. Because if you accepted the hadith, most of your lies will be confronted. But by saying you follow the Quran, only you have no escape because the Quran is much worse for you regarding showing women in a negative light. I could, for instance, say, why does the Quran say you need multiple witnesses for women when testifying? But the same isn't true for men. This is in Quran 2282. Number 2, why does the Quran say if any of your women are guilty of lewdness, confine them to a house until death do claim them, or Allah ordain for them some other way? Al-Nisa, Surah Al-Nisa 415. How is this abuse acceptable to prison a woman you claim guilty inside the house? Also, the verse doesn't say if any of your men are found guilty of lewdness, lock him inside the house. So why does this verse display sexism? Locking a woman in the house, but not locking a man in the house. By the way, I understand why this is the case, and it makes perfect sense to me. Of course, I have my Muslim belief in this, but a feminist can't accept this. If these were hadith, it would also be questionable, right? But when it's the Quran, what's your excuse? So you Quranists cannot run from the reality that just like you reject hadith, I can make you question the Quran. That's why we say Quranism leads to apostasy. And remember how they lied before. They earlier lied and said, they don't reject the Quran. They don't say that the Quran is outdated. And they don't say that the verse is not applicable anymore. And earlier she lied. She said that the verse isn't valid anymore. She actually said that. She said it doesn't apply anymore. And then later on she tried to say, no, I'm not saying it's not valid. So she keeps gish galloping back and forth. And look what she says now. She says, I am not a Quranist. You don't know me, still keep judging me. Notice, listen. First I used the Quran, and then she said she believes in the Quran, but she says anything other than that is questionable. Right? And then when I show her where she's a Quranist and a Hadith rejecter, she then says, I'm not a Quranist. So she accepts the hadith. First she says the hadith is questionable, and then when you tell them, are you a Quranist? She then says, I'm not a Quranist. SubhanAllah. Unbelievable how gishkalping, switching back and forth. And then she conveniently says, you don't know me, still keep judging me. Apparently, I don't know her and it's wrong for me to judge her, but she claims she knows all of the marriages and she judges every single marriage, saying that men who marry more than one cannot be just. Imagine. And then she says, how typical, look, now playing the victim. Now the feminists love playing the victim. She says, how typical of self-righteous people sitting on the high horse. She's judging all of the Muslim men, saying they can't. Any Muslim man that marries more than one wife, there's no way he could share his love with two spouses. Right? Demonizing men and claiming that this is a deficiency. There is no way they could do this. And then she says, how typical of you on a self-righteous, sitting on a high horse, judging everyone. I mean, this person, it's like they lack self-awareness. They write these stuff, they lack self-awareness. And then listen what she says. She says, since you have found out the absolute truth, there is no reason to waste your time. Have a nice life, son. And she's running now. She's running. She doesn't want to talk anymore. Right? Because I showed they tried to, at the beginning, they tried to say there's no way a Muslim man of today can share his love with two women. And then I brought up the Prophet's hadith, where he married 9 wives. I showed the Quran where it allows polygamous marriages. She turned around and said, oh, this is just the Prophet, the Prophet, who is she to judge? And then I showed the verse in the Quran where it says it's not just for the Prophet, it's for all Muslim men. And then she turned around and said, oh, this verse doesn't apply today because no Muslim men, it's not applicable. The condition of the verse changes because our morals and ethics have changed today. And then when I asked her to use the same standard on other things, where there's hadiths that say that most women who go to hellfire, majority of them will be in hellfire because they can't do justice with men. And I said, should we reject now normal marriages as well? And I used verses of the Quran where it says that those who follow their desires, these people, Allah has sealed their hearts, and that she shouldn't be just rejecting the Quran on this basis. She turned around and said she doesn't reject the Quran. And then I showed verses about women in the Quran who are majority are doing injustice, and that's why they're in hellfire, because they're not fulfilling these conditions. She then turns around and, because I use a hadith, she turned around and says, she believes in the Quran and everything in the hadith is questionable. And then when I said, are you a Quranist? She turns around and says she's not a Quranist. And then she requests not to be judged while she started judging everyone and all the brothers. And then in the end, when I showed how the Quran shows areas where you need multiple witnesses for women to testify to an account, where you don't need as many when it comes to men. And of course I showed about the Surah Nisa 4:15, about lewdness, confine them to a house until death claims upon them. These are women who are found guilty of committing fornication or adultery, confine them to the house, and this isn't the same isn't mentioned for men. She then turned around and said she doesn't want to have a discussion anymore, have a nice day, and so forth. And my last response to her was, you just said you believe in the Quran and everything else is questionable. So if you're not a hadith rejecter, why claim it's questionable? It's funny how you have a knee-jerk reaction regarding being judged, despite the fact that you judged every single man by saying no man can be just with multiple wives. The irony, hey, so you don't wish to be judged yourself while expressing your judgment of others. Typical hypocrite.